Good morning, everyone. And I want to give a warm welcome to all of our participants this morning, both here in person and joining remotely on Zoom. This panel discussion is hosted by the Center on Contemporary China and the World, known as CCCW, here at the University of Hong Kong. My name is Mally Prythurch, and I am the assistant to the director at the center. On behalf of our director, Li Chung, welcome to all of you today. The US-China technological rivalry has quickly become one of the defining narratives of our era, reshaping everything from global supply chains to global geopolitics, innovation ecosystems, and even cultural exchange. So too often, though, discussions about tech go into our binaries: authoritarianism versus democracy, decoupling versus engagement, competition versus collaboration. And today we aim to move beyond these binaries by bringing together two Western professionals whose careers have been shaped by navigating the complexities of China's tech landscape. Their dual perspectives will offer rare insights into how these two superpowers are shaping and being shaped by today's rapid technological transformation. This event is part of CCCW's broader mission to address critical governance challenges in an interconnected world. Today's topic, which is science and technological transformation, is one of our 5 critical research areas here at CCCW. Our first panelist, who is joining us in person and you'll hear from shortly, is Jacob Dreyer, who is the senior editor for politics, economics, and law at Palgrave. He's also a Shanghai-based writer, a contributor to the New York Times, Nature magazine, Noema, as well as others. His forthcoming book, Human Nature, grapples with a question that is both urgent and existential. How will the rise of artificial global intelligence redefine political and economic systems globally, particularly in China, where technological transformation is closely intertwined with national strategy? Joining us virtually is Travis Tanner, the Senior Managing Director at Ankara, President of Greenpoint Group, and Vice Chair of the American Chamber of Commerce, China. With over 25 years of experience advising multinational corporations on China's regulatory environment and market dynamics, Travis will bring a granular operational perspective to today's discussion. His work bridges both boardroom strategy and on-the-ground realities, helping companies adapt to China's fast-changing tech landscape while hopefully fostering cross-border dialogue in an era of rising tensions. To our audience, whether you're joining us virtually or here in person, we do encourage you to engage actively with our question and answer session. We will begin today's discussion by having each of our panelists give a short presentation, move into a moderated discussion, and then turn to you for questions. If you're joining us on Zoom, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. We're going to begin today with Travis, and I want to thank you all again for joining us. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Mally, thank you very much for kicking us off and for the kind invitation and introduction as well. It's a good morning to all those who are participating in today's session. I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate in this session. Big thanks to Dr. Chung Li for the invitation, Mally for organizing the event, and Jacob, look forward to learning from you throughout this conversation. As Mally mentioned, I run Greenpoint Group, which is the U.S.-China strategic advisory firm. So I'm joining you virtually from Beijing. We work both in offices in Washington, D.C. and in Beijing, and serve as a trusted advisor to executives of world's leading corporations and nonprofit organizations. What I thought I would do in my couple of minutes here to kick us off is just walk us through 3 points. This first slide, and I hope everyone can see this, I'm going to talk about a little bit about the context, so to help us level set and provide a foundation on which today's conversation can proceed, is to look back over the last number of years in the bilateral relationship. Where have we come? What's the foundational elements of the bilateral relationship on which this discussion around technology rivalry rests? And then second, look ahead. What are some key questions? What are some key trends for us to keep our eye on in this space? And then I will conclude with a third slide where I will just share a couple of questions and observations specifically in the space of technology competition under the second Trump administration. And so if we could move to the next slide, I think it's slide number 3 on the screen. I've tried here to just sketch out, again, looking over the last 2.5 or 2 point, there we go. 2 plus a little bit of administration. So back about 9 years. Where are we? So to start, if we go back to President Trump's first administration, those early U.S. actions in the technology space are easily described as mostly defensive, right? So restrictive measures that the U.S. government put in place aimed at slowing or containing Chinese technology development. So we saw export controls and import controls. We saw inbound and outbound investment restrictions. There were telecommunications and electronic licensing regimes put in place. There were visa bans, financial sanctions, technology transition rules that were implemented, spending limits, federal spending limits put in place, and even law enforcement actions that all focused on China. Now, the 3 points here, just quickly, you all recall that the phase one trade deal struck between Washington and Beijing. The key elements of that were around purchases and around pledges around currency. But there was an element of that first trade deal that focused on intellectual property. And so relevant to today's discussion, that element of the phase one trade deal contained commitments by China to follow through on previous pledges to eliminate any pressure for foreign companies to transfer technology to Chinese firms as a condition to market access. So that was one element of that key initial trade deal. There are also export controls, in particular the focus on semiconductors. The administration tightened export controls to prevent Chinese access to kind of cutting-edge chips and manufacturing tools, specifically targeting companies like Huawei. There was also the entity list that was launched back in 2019 by the U.S. Commerce Department, placing Huawei and 68 affiliates on that list. In the realm of artificial intelligence, in 2020, the Commerce Department imposed controls on geospatial imagery AI software. And under the kind of broader export control regime 2 years earlier, they began identifying emerging and foundational technologies. So that space of AI was already starting to be an area of focus by the U.S. government back in 2018. And you'll recall some Chinese firms that were blacklisted, such as Hikvision, SenseTime, Megvii, et cetera. And then kind of the last point here under the first Trump administration is some of the investment restrictions that went into place. President Trump moved to restrict Chinese access to U.S. capital and to prevent Chinese investment in sensitive American sectors. Back in 2018, he signed the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, FIRMA, which expanded the powers of CFIUS to vet and block foreign investment in critical technologies and infrastructure. So again, going back, right, 9 or so years ago, this era of technology competition really started and kicked off. I guess I should mention one last thing that will be relevant to today's conversation. I'll defer to Jacob, but you all recall back in 2020 when the Trump administration expanded the tech crackdown to include Chinese mobile apps, so TikTok and WeChat, the initial ban. And anyway, there was that effect, the 45 days that were allowed for TikTok ownership to be sold to a U.S. firm. And now look where we are, right? 9 years, or I guess not 9 years. Here we are, 5+ years later. Still, this is a major element of the bilateral relationship, and we can come back to that. But all kind of starting in that first Trump administration. Then moving on to President Biden's administration. Recall National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan regularly used the phrase "small yard, high fence" to describe the Biden administration's intent to allow most trade and economic relations with China to continue outside of a core of heavily restricted products, technologies, and business activities, right? So that small yard, high fence was a key theme throughout the Biden administration time. And again, what was protected in that small yard and high fence was really focused on technology. There are also export controls that were put in place, again, investment restrictions, so a carrying on of some of the policies implemented during the first Trump administration that went even deeper, expanded even more in that space, plus the addition of supply chain resilience efforts. So the CHIPS and Science Act that was signed into law in August 2022 that allocated more funding to support semiconductor research, development, and manufacturing in the U.S. So kind of a deeper dive on some of those key policy areas that were launched during the Trump initial term. And then I mentioned this AI dialogue. It didn't get a lot of traction, but I think worth mentioning back in November 2023 when President Xi and President Biden met in San Francisco. One of the outcomes or deliverables from that engagement was both restarting military-to-military interactions. There was cooperation around fentanyl, but there was also this new AI dialogue that was launched. So an effort to kind of put some guardrails in place and to begin discussions on this important part of managing competition. Again, didn't go very far, but I think notable to mention as we look ahead at what trends we might see going forward. And then to bring us up to the current time, what are we, about 75 days or so into President Trump's second administration? I'll just highlight 2 points. One, the America First investment policy that was announced back on February 22nd. This memo signaled a redoubling of efforts to restrict foreign investment in certain strategic sectors of the U.S. economy, including technology, critical infrastructure, healthcare, agriculture, energy, and so on. But again, focus on this important area of technology. So keep that in mind. Again, this memo was really a statement of a policy direction, no concrete actions coming out of that. But one of the consequential policy changes or policies noted in the memo is a directive that agencies create an expedited fast-track process to facilitate foreign investment from certain allies and partners in U.S. businesses with advanced technologies. So the memo did not state what that process will look like or who would qualify as an ally or partner, but does direct U.S. agencies to base determinations on objective standards and encourage investment by U.S. U.S. allies into U.S. business areas in the technology space. So we'll see how that moves forward as we move into the future. And then finally, Liberation Day. This is kind of hot topic, big news last week. President Trump's sweeping new slate of tariffs, including focus on China, that will really disrupt trade flows that are central to global technology firms' business models. I won't go into all the details given our time, but again, we saw major tech stocks listed on the U.S. Stock Exchange really sink on Wednesday. I think I saw maybe one example was Apple stock that tumbled 9%. Wiping out about $300 billion in value in that one day. So significant implications for the technology space. And I'll pause there and just move on to our next slide and move us through kind of looking ahead. So that was kind of taking stock. Here's the context. Now, as we look ahead, just a few core questions for us to focus on as we think about the future. Number one, when will the Presidents Trump and President Xi meet? And I guess if and when, and then will there be some kind of U.S.-China deal made? Question number two, how hot will the kind of trade war or trade tensions get? We saw a retaliation to the Liberation Day tariffs by Beijing on Friday, which were quite significant. So again, we're seeing tensions currently on the increase. Around global dynamics, how do Trump's policies affect China ties with Russia, with other neighbors, with the EU, across the global south? These will all be important questions as we think about development of technology. Of course, questions around inflation, around markets, as I just mentioned. There's always the question of black swan events. What are the potential developments that we're not currently indexing that might take place that would have major implications for development of technology and cooperation and or rivalry? And then this idea and focus of today's discussion on technology competition, which takes us to the next slide and the final slide. I'll just mention a couple of points here before passing the mic to Jacob. The tightening of export controls on China displays this kind of progress on AI. So technology competition, again, has been an area of uncertainty with the new Trump administration coming into power. Number one, the question was, would the new Trump administration be responsive to industry concerns and maybe soften President Biden's semiconductor export controls on China, or would it further tighten those export controls? A widening of export controls announced on March 26th is the latest indication that the Trump team is for now taking or looking to take an even harder line. The one factor influencing the Trump administration's policy, of course, has been the DeepSeek shock to U.S. markets and the demonstration of China's focus on AI progress. So per the Trump Intelligence First Annual Threat Assessment that came out also in March, was very clearly identified China's effort to displace the US as a top AI power by 2030. So we're going to see how the Trump policy in this space continues to move forward. But important to keep in mind again, this focus on AI and some of these important questions. So two quick questions, and I'll pass the mic to Jacob. Number one, on government capacity. So even as the Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry and Security, this key body in charge of export controls, is being asked to do more in this space, the Trump administration also in March sought to cut funding for BIS by about 10% this year. So interesting to be putting more focus and tasking this part of the government to do more, but also shrinking the amount of resources that it has. What will that look like, and how will that impact the Trump administration's policy toward China? We'll see. And then a second question, just around deal making. What's the space look like now for a Beijing and Washington deal? On the 26th, when Trump announced that those initial tariffs on China, or announced that those initial tariffs on China could be lowered in return for Beijing's support for a sale of TikTok to U.S. owners, indicates, right, that Trump's personal interests on any given issue may override policy preferences of his national security team. So that transactional nature that the President Trump focuses on, will there be space there for him to lower tariffs, in this case around TikTok, or some other negotiating point between the two capitals, will be another important question for us to keep our eyes on. So I'll go ahead and pause there and turn the time over to Jacob.
Here, or I'm going to be well, you can. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Travis, for your comments, which I think give a very practical and empirical grounding for our discussion that's coming up. And thanks for Dr. Lee and for Mally and everyone else involved in this event. I think that in contrast, I would describe myself in contrast to Travis as almost like an anthropologist of Chinese policy, and also increasingly of the new American policy space, which is evolving quickly. I've been in China for quite a while, Travis no doubt longer, but for the last 10 years, I've been publishing books about politics and economics, and therefore engaging with thinkers like Dr. Lee, but also many more mainland thinkers publishing their books and so forth. And just by coincidence, the company I work for also is the company that publishes the science journal Nature. But I had no real involvement with Nature for the first 8 years of this job. I just saw the guys in the office. Mouse. Yeah. But what changed in my mind was, in my ongoing quest to understand the dynamics in China, when I first got to China in 2008, I thought it was about urbanization. So I studied architecture at the Architecture Association in London. Then I thought, I still don't understand it. It must be about language. So I studied Chinese literature with Zhang Shudong at New York University. I got back to China and I realized many Chinese people speak Chinese, yet they still don't understand China. So then I thought maybe it's economics. And from maybe 2015 to about 2022, I really tried to understand the underlying dynamics of the Chinese economy. But I believe that as a consequence of some of what Travis was discussing, the US-China relationship, but even more than any political change, underlying technological change, I guess in my understanding, technology comes first and politics comes afterwards. Because of underlying technological change, I think that the dynamic within China has changed. And for me, at the 20th CPC, we heard all about how Chairman Xi is taking his third term and blah, 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 and Li Keqiang is going away, whatever. For me, what was really significant was the emphasis on technology and science. So just for example, Nature publishes this thing, the Nature Index. That's just a kind of rating of which universities are better in what fields. Now, the reality is the Nature Index is made by 2 or 3 kind of clever people living in Zone 4 of London. And so for me, it's almost alarming to hear Chinese policymakers such as Xi Jinping himself mentioning the Nature Index repeatedly, because I'm just like, it's just my friend Simon who does this thing. Like, so I feel actually that within Nature, my colleagues don't necessarily have an awareness of how important it is to the Chinese government to advance technologically. So for me, this is summed up why Xi's comment we must regard science and technology as our primary productive force. What was previously the primary productive force? It's labor, right? China had the low-cost labor advantage. China is from below to above. China is making a lot of cheap stuff in Guangdong province to sell to Walmart, but that's no longer the case. Now, science and technology is the primary productive force. China's primary advantage in the global economy is not low-cost labor, because in fact, it's not low-cost anymore. Rather, it's science and technology. What does that look like? That looks like Huawei in markets across the global south. That looks like BYD. That looks like China's leadership of the green energy transition. So that's my understanding of what that phrase is. Talent is our primary resource. In other words, it's not that there's this demographic dividend, so many cheap workers because of whatever one-child policy. Rather, it's this huge flood of Chinese college graduates, I think 12 million this year, who are going to be working in STEM research. So that's why we see the expansion of Western companies like AstraZeneca, not yesterday, not before Trump tariffs, right now in a city like Shanghai. Why? Because there are so many very intelligent Chinese college graduates. There's 12 million every single year, and they frankly do research just as good or perhaps even better than those of college graduates in other countries such as the United States. So you start to see a real scale, a logic of scale in terms of talent. Talent, for me, I understand it as just research, STEM talent. And innovation is our primary driver of growth. So I just took this phrase, but there's many other times he talks about this. For me, this is the most succinct one, where he says there's a structural change in the Chinese economy. Before, we're from below to above. We're based on low-cost labor advantage. And that's why tariffs and a trade deal could make sense. But now the Chinese economy is going from above to below in the sense that technology is driving a move up the supply chain to make things like really quality cars or telephones or computers or AI large language models or pharmaceuticals. And we're going to sell those to whoever wants high quality and inexpensive ones. I was recently on the airplane here, actually. I was reading the very intelligent Arthur Krober's 2017 book about the Chinese economy. And I think a lot of what he says is correct. But there's a few things that he says that seem a bit dated. One is he specifically says, if China's innovative, why is the Chinese car industry in 2017 just so unimpressive? And obviously that's changed. Another is that he says, China is generally speaking like 80% of the quality with 60% of the price. I think in 2017 that was true, but that has changed. Why has it changed? There's a number of factors. One is just the rapid expansion of technology and how China has embraced automation, Internet of Things, all these logistics networks. When we say artificial intelligence, it's a kind of portmanteau term. In fact, TikTok with its algorithm is artificial intelligence. That's why Elon Musk just sold Twitter, or X, to himself, to his AI service, Grok, because the real business model of Twitter is just to collect data and turn it into AI algorithms. And that's also the thing with TikTok. I mean, if China is controlling TikTok, they're getting the data. And if the US is controlling TikTok, then one of Trump's friends is getting the data. It seems to me that that's actually the really pertinent issue here. So one primary factor is that as a patriotic American, I feel that some of our policies have been somewhat self-defeating in the sense that today we see Huawei as a profitable company that's doing all number of incredible things, not least championing Chinese semiconductor drive. Back in 2017, it was just a company, as Arthur Krober says, making cheap cell phones. What changed? Arresting the guy's daughter is what changed it. And like all the other stuff that happened. In other words, in that kind of logic of whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger, the US administrations, not just Trump, but also Biden, didn't kill China. So what's the other thing you can do? They've forced China to rapidly, painfully make reforms. That the scholar Zheng Yongnian, he talks about the World Trade Organization 2.0. What he means is that in the head up to joining the World Trade Organization, there were all these complicated and painful reforms that many domestic lobbies in China did not want to make on taxes, on SOEs and stuff. But because China was going to join the World Trade Organization, Zhu Rongji was able to say, like, look, we've got to do this. It's not me saying it, it's these foreigners saying it. So we've got to do this. Similarly, in a strange dialectical logic, the policies of the Trump and Biden and now Trump administration are systematically forcing China. There's many people in China who would love to continue owning factories, selling Christmas tree ornaments to Walmart, but that's not allowed anymore. And it's not because of the Chinese government, it's because of the US government. China now must produce high technology products. And those high technology products, whether they're BYD cars, they're solar panels, whatever, they're not available for sale to the United States. So any tariffs that are put on China by the Trump administration today will not be relevant to BYD because BYD sells 0 cars in the United States. They will not be relevant to CATL because CATL could not even invest a factory in Michigan, although it tried. It will only be relevant to this, let's say, the economy of the past. It's not relevant to the economy of the future. That's my personal explanation for why when I ask Chinese friends, like I was chatting with Zhang Jun, the Dean of Economics at Fudan, he's like, oh, well, we don't really care about the tariffs. In fact, it might even help us on our path. And it could seem like bravado, but in a way, is China thinking today about moving up the supply chain to making semiconductors and cars, none of which will be sold in the United States? Or is it really worried about how to preserve the Christmas tree ornament industry? I think in a sense, these tariffs will only aid and abet the ongoing high-tech drive in China. So that's my view. But I mentioned that I perceive myself as a bit of an anthropologist. That's because I'm not actually a research scientist. So in the spirit of modesty, these are some hypotheses which I would be very happy if you challenged or problematized of mine. What are some of the differences between Chinese science and American science? Science, I mean, structurally speaking, is just a system of objectively tested techniques and methods. There's no difference between this bag in America and this bag in China. So it's about the user. If science can be conceived of as a series of tools, who is using the tool for what? In the United States, science is funded through this venture capital system of many people, such as Mark Andreessen, who have actually joined the Trump administration. In China, the funding for science is overwhelmingly coming from the government. What does Mark Andreessen and these VCs want? They want returns on investment. But the Chinese government, they may not actually have the same goal of just immediately returns on investment. They may have different goals. For example, upgrading Chinese healthcare system. For example, making the logistics network function more effectively. For example, making education be more accessible to people in the rural, 39% of the population with rural hukou. So I think that basically for me, one of the key differences, we can all use a tool, but what do we use it for? China's government, which is the primary, let's say, funder of science in China, has a certain set of objectives. The US venture capital community has a different set of objectives. So therefore, it's rational that the tool will be used in different ways. One key point is that the Chinese economy is a production economy. And when I recently wrote in Nature magazine about the logic of Chinese AI, I said, well, because China is about production, AI, what's called AI, which actually means so many different things from the Internet of Things to big data being used, whatever. But basically, what's the thing China is trying to do is produce objects effectively at scale. And so therefore, we see things like the Chinese high-speed train system using AI. We see things like the warehouse temperature cooling and heating system using AI. And a lot of these uses are actually very simple. Your iPhone could run the whole warehouse network nationally. You don't need something very complicated. On the other hand, and that's because China's economy is 60% is about production and manufacturing. And many people in China, like Huang Qifan, the former mayor of Chongqing, actually want production to go up. But currently, China is occupying a role in global production. I saw quoted by the head of the EU Chamber of Commerce in Beijing as 36% yesterday. I don't know the numbers, but we all know that China today is a manufacturing superpower, the likes of which has not been seen since the United States in 1945. So that's what China is using AI for, to run factories. What is the US economy about? It's about consumption. I didn't write the statistic here, but I think it's something like 65, 66% of US economy is consumption. Consequently, what do we use AI for? Well, we use AI to turn a picture of me and my girlfriend into a Studio Ghibli style illustration. I'm not trying to make a joke here. I'm just saying that if the Chinese economy is about making money by producing things, then AI will enhance the efficiency and productivity of producing things. And if the American economy is a consumption-driven economy, then AI will primarily seek to fill the needs of consumers, whether that's how I use ChatGPT to do my research, whether that's like how Jane Street, the quant fund, probably uses AI to time the stock market. So I think that's straightforward enough. A second thing that I hear a lot about So we've heard so much about how China is going to completely crash and die because of the demographic change in the aging society and so on and so forth. At the same time, we do have this youth unemployment problem in China. So how can it be that at the same time China has not enough people, but also mass unemployment? Doesn't really make sense. What I've heard from many Chinese economists and if also factory owners is you have a lot of the factory sector, which is completely automated. There's this term lights out factories. You don't even need a single person in these factories. So what I envision, and I've been to a few like Yanglao like senior citizen care home, where you see these intelligent robots, many of which developed in Japan. I went to a place in Yixing, Jiangsu province, that Panasonic, the Japanese company, invested in, where they're just trying to get robots and automation. I mean, let's just say the problem they're trying to solve is how to take care of old people. And so I believe that a huge market a huge demand in China will be how to solve this problem. There's so many old people and not enough young people working for them. And I think that automation and AI will tend to try to solve this problem. In other words, the Chinese economy is a system of solving Chinese problems. And so I tend to think that the demographic change will not be as severe as of a problem as people imagine, because robotization and automation will keep driving productivity per capita up. So even if in the future there's not as many Chinese workers, that's okay, because instead of being blue-collar factory workers, they're going to be white-collar, like Huawei engineers or something. And one of those guys makes 5 times what the factory worker makes. Mathematically, therefore, the Chinese economy can be twice as big with half the number of people. It's not that hard to understand, right? So that's what I've heard from some Chinese economists who tell me that rather than being concerned that the Chinese economy is going to languish for lack of workers, the more immediate concern is, what do you do with these 12 million college graduates who are coming online every year? There's a labor surplus right now. And that's driven by a number of factors, but unmistakably, one is that automation is coming through China fast and hard. And you see many factories that not long ago would have 3,000, 5,000 people that now have 20. And that's only going to get more. Okay, so I already spoke a bit about this. These are hypotheses again, so tell me if I'm wrong. I believe that Chinese science, driven by CAS, Tsinghua, and even by Huawei, is it a private company? It's kind of hard to say. Its ownership structure is unique. But they are all oriented to solving challenges that the Chinese government sets. In that sense, if China is a public-private economy, you can say that the Chinese government and the Fagaiwei are like the brain part, and that these institutions are the muscles which are solving the problems. But it is true, at least in technology, that China is a centrally planned economy, because there's very much like some guys in Beijing who are like, here's our biggest problems, A, B, C, D. All right, here's the money, figure it out. So to that sense, I think it's fair to say that China is a planned economy. How about America? Actually, we would like to think that America is a free market capitalism. That's the theory. But the reality is that there's not that much difference between what the Fagaiwei is doing and what Marc Andreessen is doing, or what Elon Musk is doing. Similarly, in America, there's like a few guys who are like, okay, we have all these money at our disposal. We want to solve whatever problem, and we're going to make a plan and do it. And that is not democracy, and that is not capitalism, but that is what the United States economy is today. Fourth hypothesis, China tends to be leading the world in climate science and adaptation. Why might that be the case? Not to be too self-referential, I wrote an editorial for the New York Times last April 19th about this. I think there's 2 reasons why China wants to do the green transition. Number one is because, unlike the United States, it's not an oil exporter, it's an oil importer. Oil is imported to China via the Strait of Malacca, and you constantly have US military guys being like, aha, when the war starts, we're going to cut them off. I think the Chinese government listens and is like, all right, we need to stop using oil as fast as possible. I personally also believe that's a driving factor in the Chinese relationship with Russia. I think the Chinese economy, government wants to diversify its energy portfolio as much as possible in case one part of the supply gets cut off. So rather than saying we're only going to use Russian oil, which they don't, or we're only using Saudi oil, or we're only using coal or solar, they're kind of maximizing and building more capacity than they might need. Why might that be? Well, actually, in the 90s, China built more infrastructure than it might need and more housing than it might need. But 5 years later, it turned out they needed it. So maybe these guys are planning 5 or 10 years into the future to imagine a situation where what if one of our sources of energy gets cut off, which is quite plausible. So, but because China is an energy importer and also a food importer, I think that the government, and also the government perceives stability as being driven by the ability to provide energy and food. Consider Chengdu in 2021, the Yangtze River dried up, the hydropower Three Gorges Dam doesn't work, and a lot of old people in Chengdu died because the air conditioner wasn't able to work. I believe that the Chinese government takes as its highest priorities social stability, which is about no food price inflation, unlike in the year 1989, and the old people don't die of preventable causes. And in that sense, I think that that's one of the reasons why one of the big tasks that the Chinese government is setting for science is energy security, food security, figured out. And science can provide many solutions to those, and the solar stuff is a big part of that. Last, this is again a hypothesis. Chinese science tends to be more exportable to the global south than, say, your Apple or your Tesla. Why? Damien Ma, the economist based in Chicago, pointed out that the Chinese GDP per capita is 12,500 US dollars. Actually, if you take 8 billion humans in the world, the per capita income on average of the whole world is the same amount. So therefore, if I'm Tesla, I sell a car that an American can afford, that's great, but people in Indonesia can't afford it. I'm selling some product that someone in Guiyang can afford, then the Indonesians, Brazilians, Turkish can afford it too. Why? Because the Chinese people consumer are much closer to the global median, whereas the American consumer of high-tech products are not. So to the extent that the Chinese government is trying to solve problems of rural poverty, those are the problems of the world. To the extent that, say, Mark Andreessen is trying to solve how do I get high shareholder returns, that's not the problem that Indonesia faces. So that's why I believe that Chinese tech companies, let's say tech in the broadest sense, including BYD, CATL, Huawei, whatever, Oppo, Xiaomi. That's why I think these tech companies do better in the global south, simply because the Chinese consumer median income is much closer to the global south. Therefore, the price that's the China price is already appropriate to the global south, whereas the price for California is not similar to the global south. And one last and kind of unpleasant point to make is the difference between EU member states and global south in per capita incomes is not as big as we might have thought. In fact, I think there's quite a few Chinese provinces like Zhejiang that are almost per capita. If you factor in the PPP, they're pretty much France or above. And you go to Zhejiang and you go to France, you're like, yeah, it's true. So I think a big question for me about Chinese science is, will the Europeans think, hey, we want those 10,000 euro BYD cars as well? Or will US pressure continue to make the EU close off their market for some national security reasons, whatever those may be? Here's an interesting comment by Ren Zhengfei. Again, I speak not as someone trying to say objective facts. I speak as someone who's trying to understand how people within the system perceive it as operating. So I don't say these Chinese thinkers are right. I just say that they're going to determine what happens in China. The CEO of Huawei said the direct contribution of AI software platforms like ChatGPT to human society is less than 2%, with the other 98% promoting industrial and agricultural society. What does it mean? It means that in terms of productivity gains, in terms of economic GDP growth, AI is going to do amazing stuff for agriculture. You look at these huge farms, and for example, my wife is from Heilongjiang, so I go up to like Beidahuang. They have Beidahuang Qiyie. It kind of started in the 70s. It was almost like a big collective farm thing. It's actually, I believe, listed on an American market, but it's a super, super communist organization, like unbelievably so. This is actually the group that in 1967 fought the war with the Soviets in Zhenbaodao. It wasn't a PLA. It was actually this agricultural SOE, which has its own army, much like the Xinjiang Bingtuan. These guys are automating in a major way. They're using drones to do fertilizer. They're doing like massive automation because the Dongbei population is going down. People really don't want to do this work. I can imagine a future as someone who hopes to be a homeowner in Heilongjiang province soon, where Heilongjiang is like Montana. No one really lives there. There's huge farms, there's military installations, there's nature, and there's no people there. Fine. There's no reason to think that agriculture, the crop is going to go down. In fact, it's going to go up because AI and robotics can do that. So what Ren Zhengfei is saying is ChatGPT and these kind of consumer applications are very impressive and interesting and fun, But as far as what's going to like drive 5 to 10% GDP growth in China and also in global markets, it's probably going to be about rapidly accelerating gains in agriculture, energy, logistics, manufacturing. At least that's how I understand his statement. I talked a little bit about this before, but one thing that I've heard that I find intriguing is this notion that China has two massive megatrends that are meeting. One is the aging population, and one is automation. So at the same time as you have the number of people who are working in factories and stuff is declining, you have robots who can do that type of work. Of course, all our white collar work as a guy wearing a white collar this very second is no doubt very hard and impressive. But with my kids, we have a IE to help with the kids, right? The reality is the IE is working much, much harder than me in terms of actual real stuff. I realize that every single Sunday when she has her day off. But so if the robots can do all this hard manual labor stuff, actually, you can't keep working in a factory until you're 65. But you can keep on talking about AI at HKU until you're 80. So I think that we may see the retirement age pushing up in China, because if it's white collar work that we're doing and the robots are doing all the like manual labor, then the people can work for longer, especially because the education rate is going up. So I myself am a little bit less pessimistic or bearish about prospects for the Chinese economy driven by demographic factors. I think automation will pick up a lot of the slack. There are, of course, other implications. China will be a society of old people, which are conservative, not like politically, they just like don't want to go outside. They, it's a kind of very different place. In downtown Shanghai, it's all these like old people square dancing, going to the vegetable market. It's nothing like, New York City or whatever. It's very calm and peaceful. For me, I like that at this point in life. But there's a word in Arabic, I forget what it's called, the men who stand against the walls. That's because they have this huge youth bulge of these unemployed, angry young men, like in Palestine, for example. There's so many rights and wrongs about what's happening in the Middle East, but a place where you have a huge amount of unemployed young men is a place where you're going to have a problem. China's not going to have that problem. I'm almost done. This is a picture that I took in Guizhou during the pandemic. And I think this is an interesting, concrete example, put some meat on the bones of what I'm saying. So I went to this place, Big Data Valley in Guizhou. First, why did they do big data in Guizhou, this very poor and indebted province? Two reasons. One, because it has a lot of access to cheap electricity because of hydroelectric dams. Two, because the central government is like, oh, Guizhou is a poor, indebted province. We need to give them something useful. We don't want to have everything be in Beijing. We want to distribute the economic drivers. So it's kind of common prosperity policy. Anyways, so you look at the screen, they're using all these big data, and the government's like, you have all the money, you have all the electricity, solve all these people in villages having good healthcare. So in Guizhou, you have these small villages, they're very inaccessible, they're in mountains. People don't have good healthcare. It doesn't make any sense to like build hospitals in all of them. The doctors don't want to go there anyway. However, they kind of have, these are all like indicators. Where is there more cancer? Where there's more heart disease? How about the air quality? Stuff like that. And they built with a Ping'an Haodaifu, a kind of, I would say, ChatGPT for healthcare. So basically, if you're like, okay, doctor, 箱子疼, 胃疼, 我睡不好觉. And then the Ping'an Haodaifu or this like ChatGPT of healthcare can kind of diagnose what the problem is. And it'll say, 多喝点水, and then it's all finished. But basically, in a lot of these places that lack healthcare in China, what you lack is doctors. You don't lack nurses, because you can find people who are like able to be caretakers, but you lack the people who can make diagnoses. AI is exactly good at the doctor role. It cannot do the nurse role, but it can totally do the doctor role. And in that sense, I have a feeling when I went to this place that they want to provide a universal healthcare in China, but they don't want to build hospitals for 500 million people. That would be really expensive. What if you can just like make an iPhone app? And then that's kind of 90% of the way. First of all, that would be incredible. That would really help China's rural population. Second of all, there are many countries around the world that also have healthcare problems. Let's not mention the US, because I don't believe we'll ever accept Chinese technology. But for example, the British NHS constantly under pressure for economic reasons, extremely significantly important to the country. What if the Chinese government was like, hey, we found a way to cut the NHS cost by 50%. And then Trump is like, if you use it, then you're communists. I think that would be a really big challenge for a British government. And I think it's happening soon. In other words, if China, that's what I mean when I say China's technology solves Chinese problems. What Mark Andreessen wants is companies that challenge the frontiers of science, generating shareholder returns. The Chinese government sees its population, the cup is almost half empty, right? There's like 300 million rounding up middle class, another 300 or 400 million kind of urban working class. But as of 2020 census, 39%, which is 540 million, are rural hukou people. So those people are not in the economy really at all. They're not consuming, they're barely producing. It's as if China is just only half of its population is fully mobilized. So if you can inexpensively leverage technology to provide healthcare and education to these rural Chinese, it's like you just, like half of the lights are off and then you just turn them on. And that could actually really be transformative as well. That's one of the ways that I feel that if frontier American technology is about pushing the limit, the Chinese technology is often about doing things that if money was unlimited, you already could do. You could build a hospital in Guizhou. You just need money. But you don't have enough resources, so you drag those people who've been left out of the economy into it. And of course, that has implications not only for China, but primarily for the global South. I'll just move after this because I think I've been talking too long. I'm working on a piece for the New York Times now about Chinese biotech. And similarly, I would say this is not necessarily about like making some crazy new inventions. It might just be about using Chinese huge number of STEM researchers and China's huge domestic market to drive innovations that will be lower in cost. And I personally believe that the next, I don't want to say China shock, but the next industry that I anticipate China will have huge surprising gains in is healthcare and medicine, which is 17% of US GDP right now. And I think that it will be a very politically sensitive issue for Americans if they see, I mean, when we started seeing news, China's average lifespan is exceeding the United States. This is something that people talk about bitterly often. What if the Chinese Ping An Hao Daifu and these other sort of apps, plus some kind of different Chinese medications, starts to things like a cure for cancer for $10,000, which is my friends at Likang, this startup, are doing. They're in FDA trials right now. And they really take the feet out from these American global monopolies like Pfizer. And they reduce the profit margin. I think this is an interesting thing to think about. Last but not least, I remember it's 2022, and a friend of mine in the Shanghai government, he was like, well, we don't really believe in this like democracy system you guys have. I know there's like 7 guys making all the decisions like we have. So who are they? Ray Dalio, George Soros, Jamie Dimon, who are the other 4? And I was like, no. It's not like that. America's a democracy. That's it. Those are the 7 guys. Number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. That's it. They all stood up there. So that's our Politburo, and that's the Chinese Politburo. Let the best one win. Thank you.
I do want to take this moment just to remind our online audience to please go ahead. You can begin submitting questions through the Q&A. And also our audience in the room, please start thinking about any questions you might want to ask. I'm going to start off with a few of my own. I want to go first to Travis and then here in the room, because I wanted to dig down into something that both of you mentioned a little bit in your presentations, which is Trump's aggressive second-term posture in terms of trade, but also other geopolitical issues. He's combined tariffs, pressure on allies, investment bans to really change the trade landscape. And I want to know, is this something that will fundamentally fracture global R&D? Are we headed towards a bifurcated world in terms of supply chains and other R&D ecosystems? Are we going to see competing innovation blocks that are completely bifurcated, a China one and a US one, or multiple? I will go first to Travis.
Great. Melly, thank you so much for the question. And it's an important one, isn't it? I'm not going to claim to have a crystal ball and say this is the way that things will evolve in the world, but I think we certainly are seeing a lot of disruption globally. And obviously that impacts this space, the ecosystem around technology, but I think it's even much broader than that. You mentioned American allies and partners. I think right now is a time when American allies and partners are asking a lot of questions about what the future looks like and how they might respond to the current policy direction in Washington. A couple of thoughts come to mind. I think number one, just to boil it down, I think if sitting in Beijing and you're seeing what is happening globally, I think number one, we should probably expect Beijing to seek a common cause with other countries that are coping with U.S. trade measures. So during the Biden administration, there was a significant effort made by Washington to improve and strengthen relations with allies and partners around the world, in particular, as it related to policy toward China. Think about some of the efforts made specifically in the space around technology. Right, we talked about export controls, other restrictions that the Biden administration put on around policy focus on China. They would put the policy in place and then reach out to countries, Netherlands, Japan, others, to say, now we need you to do this too. We need you to get on board with our direction here. And in some cases that worked better than in other cases. But generally, I think the trend was a strengthening of allies, strengthening of partnerships around the world. And now I think that's all in question. And again, so I would expect Beijing, number one, to seek common cause with other countries. And I think, as Jacob just articulated so well, there is a lot happening in China when it comes to innovation, when it comes to developing technology. And we know, and we've heard now for a number of years, kind of priority number one from Beijing's perspective is to become the world's leader in the critical technologies that will define the future. So I don't think that's going to slow down. I think one of Beijing's strongest responses to the Trump administration has been its strategic clarity. It's not going to change what it's focused on, and that is a transition kind of up the value chain in its economy to become a technology leader. And I think becoming a more appealing partner for some of America's longstanding trade partners and allies is going to happen. So watch to see what happens in the global South. I would expect trade relations between China and global South countries to become stronger. I think relations between Beijing and capitals in Europe will become stronger. And then number two point here would be, I don't think Beijing at this point probably has near-term expectations for the two presidents to speak or meet or kind of find a quick solution. I think this is going to take some time. I think the events over the last 4 or 5 days probably signal that things aren't going to we're not going to flip a switch. President Trump come out with some kind of deal that he can put on the table and quickly find resolution and stability in the U.S.-China relationship. I actually think that the opposite is more likely. I'd say I think we should be buckling up, putting on those seatbelts and being ready as we enter into pretty uncharted waters in the broader U.S.-China relationship. And then specifically to your question, Mally, as we think about the future kind of space around innovation, it's unprecedented. And again, Jacob, I think made several really important points about how quickly things change and how technology moves a lot faster than policy, right? So policy is going to be striving to try to keep up with the pace of change in technology, and that will be, again, a brave new world.
I do want to ask a quick follow-up. You talked about how allies and countries around the world are responding to this, but what about multinational corporations, especially tech corporations? How are they kind of navigating these competing pressures that have clearly increased drastically? Are they still hedging their bets, trying to keep kind of a foot in each world? Or have they decided they're going to make their choice? They're either going to work with China and China's supply chain and China's tech ecosystem, or the US's?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I think the multinational companies are definitely in the business of keeping their foot in both economies, right? It's so important to be a globally successful company, to be competitive globally. Multinational company has to be in the United States and really needs to be in China as well. A lot of people talk about China as kind of a fitness center for companies where they need to be on the ground competing with the best competition in the world in order to be successful globally. And so making a choice and pulling out, some companies, right, have done this. And I think the bottom line answer to your question, I think really depends on the sector, but at least the companies that I work with that have had longstanding presence in China, have major investments that have been here for multiple decades, they are not pulling out of China, right? They are finding a way to navigate this space. And over the last 8 or 9 years, it's become significantly more challenging to walk that tightrope, right? You've got to be able to be compliant with legal regimes that are changing, and making it more difficult to do that. But I think it's just a couple of examples. I had the opportunity to attend the China Development Forum a couple of weeks ago that took place in Beijing. And one of the core themes of that event, this is, for those that don't know, this is the State Council held annual event every couple of years, 2-day event. Premier Li Qiang speaks and convenes, and then multiple representatives from the Chinese government. I think there was about almost 80 global CEOs in town for this event, and then other notable luminaries, right? Scholars, academics, influencers, et cetera. So a very important conference that happens each year. One of the core themes was AI. In fact, I think almost every single panel, independent of what it was that focused on, talked about artificial intelligence, what it means, how do we, get our heads around this. And then to your point, how are companies responding? I think number one, the fact that there were 80 global CEOs that participated, shows a very strong and keen interest in being engaged in the China market. One example, I think AstraZeneca came up in Jacob's comments, but the CEO, Pascal Soriot, he mentioned that his point was, 10 years ago, China was a recipient of pharmaceutical products and now is a key part of the innovation cycle, right? China is playing a critical role in scientific discovery, not just commercialization of products, but actually the driving innovation. And that's true across sectors, right? So other focuses were, green technology, the digital economy, health sector was an incredibly important focus of the CDF sessions. And I think the answer is, again, companies need to be in China to be competitive globally, because this is where some of the most important discoveries, inventions, innovation, and competition exists. So in order to compete globally, companies need to be here to cut their teeth and be able to compete against some of what will become, I think, increasingly global companies that are based here in China.
Thank you very much. And I want to ask Jacob to kind of talk from the philosophical point of view. I know your upcoming book, Human Nature, talks about how artificial general intelligence will reshape both economic and political landscape. And can you tell us a little bit about how are you seeing these blocks forming today, and how will AGI either continue that trend or change that trajectory moving forward?
Thank you. Well, since you asked me to be philosophical, if we accept that AGI could become sentient and it's evolving, right? So this is an evolutionary process that's happening. Possibly, the US-China competition in the medium term, like 10 years out, when AGI is a sentient organism, we'll just have seen it's just an evolutionary step along the way by which AI spurs its own development, because it's very clear to me that in China, AI development is driven by competition with the US and vice versa. So maybe this, budding incipient superintelligence is playing us all in order to spur its own growth. And that, 10 years later, no one really cares about steel plants in Ohio or, DeepSeek or any of that. They're just, we're living in a new era. we were speaking about R&D. So I think there's the R part. We see American institutions like the NIH, Columbia, Harvard, et cetera, under fire. And at the same time, China is, of course, investing in all its universities. For the D part, we see that a lot of development, for example, take biotech. There's a company called Wuxi AppTech that not that long ago, the US Congress tried, it didn't pass the bill to, sanction. So Wuxi AppTech is kind of like the Foxconn for the AstraZenecas of the world. That is to say that they run clinical trials, they kind of bring a product from an idea to realization. So theoretically speaking, and a lot of my colleagues at Nature are like, what the heck is going on? The US is deliberately sabotaging its research environment. But I always proceed from the sense of like, our Politburo is not stupid. So what are they thinking? They might be thinking about AI for science, this notion that artificial intelligence will drive rapid growth of scientific research without the need for humans. So in other words, what if we could just fire the US government and have ChatGPT do it instead, basically? And what if we can just not need Harvard and the NIH? We could just use artificial intelligence to do all these complicated things much better than humans can. I think that I honestly believe that when we see these confusing seeming decisions from the Trump administration, I always ask myself, a lot of people in the AI community believe AGI is happening in the next 1 or 2 years. And I think that many people in the Chinese government also believe that. So if you believe that in the next 2 or 3 years, a new form of sentience that will be able to solve problems that we currently cannot solve is happening, what would you do to prepare? Would you say, oh, well, I'm going to retrench my relationship with NATO? Oh, why? Why would you do that? Maybe you would think, well, I need to amass capital. I need to make sure my tungsten supply from Greenland is solid. And I need to shed all the ballast because we're about to take off on the spaceship. So if the Germans don't want to come along, that's their problem. I think that AI will have a lot of really profound changes. But to my way of thinking, the Chinese government, Chinese role in the global economy has traditionally been that of labor, and the US role has traditionally been that of capital since China joined the World Trade Organization or before. A lot of the people making the decisions in the US system, such as Mark Andreessen, Elon Musk, of course, there's this big division within the MAGA movement, but a lot of these people are capitalists. They are capital, and they are looking at the problem from the perspective of capital. So they don't really mind as much about unpredictable impacts. They would rather that we accelerate, and if the people in San Francisco can't pay their rent or become homeless, that's their problem. I think the Chinese government is a lot more cautious about the impacts on its population. I think they're thinking in a lot more detail about, if we allow self-driving cars, what's going to happen to the Didi drivers? If we allow those drones to deliver lunch, then what about those Olema drivers? I don't think that those considerations matter as much in the US. So therefore, I would say that when AGI comes, if it comes, there will still be profound differences because the Chinese system is trying to achieve one thing, which is stability for the Chinese population. And the US system is trying to achieve another thing, which is not necessarily related to what happens to the US population. With that said, my final comment would just be to say, I think there's this very interesting division in the MAGA movement between these kind of techno accelerationists and then these people represented by Steve Bannon who say, no, we need to stop this technology because we need to, prioritize these working class voters. Well, we'll see how that plays out.
Thank you very much. And I want to turn, we have a lot of questions coming in, so I do want to turn in just a minute to our online and in-person questions. But I want to ask both of our panelists first, in short, what advantages do both China and the US have in terms of technological innovation? I'm going to start here in the room and then go to Travis.
There's a great and interesting book by an MIT professor, Huang Yasheng. I don't agree with everything he says, but it's called The Rise and Fall of the East, EAST. It's basically his view is that the US does really well in scale. That means if I'm at Stanford, I can research anything no matter what. There's no restrictions on my thought. that tends to do really well with frontier science. 0 to 1 is what Peter Thiel calls it. The US is really good at scope, the 0 to 1 stuff. China, on the other hand, is really good at 1 to N. So not always at the frontier science, but definitely at that question of, okay, there's this expensive and unwieldy EV car. How do I, within the space of 5 years, make this awesome world-beating company? So it seems like the US is really good at frontier science, and China is really good at, 1 to N, making applied, practical supply chain business models. Having said that, in his September report, now Secretary of State Rubio said, I could find the quote if I had a computer, that China used to be good at applied science, but it's increasingly good at frontier science as well. And I think that's what we heard about the AstraZeneca CEO. Interestingly, after Peter Thiel's book 0 to 1 was published in Chinese in 2015, a year or so after that, CAS, Chinese Academy of Science, starts doing all these fundings of $100 million here and there for exactly literally 0 to 1 science. So my suspicion is that the Chinese leadership read Peter Thiel's book. They were like, that's true, that's a problem. And they're really trying to make China a place for frontier science, not just applied science. But right now, China is good at applied science.
Thank you. And Travis?
Sorry, get off mute. Yeah, that's a great response, Jacob. I fully support what you just said, and a great question. Maybe just a couple of other thoughts to build on what Jacob said. I think, again, the United States has really led for a long time in innovation and development, and I think I've expressed kind of the point here that, and China is obviously moving very quickly in this space, and innovation is becoming a core strength. Maybe I'll focus on some weaknesses. I think one thing that worries me when I think about the policy making environment in Washington, D.C., is perhaps the lack of appreciation of what China has accomplished in just like the last 10 years, and a lack of appreciation that, sometimes I worry that we still have lawmakers that think of China as only being able to innovate so far as they can steal, technology from the world, and that's not the case anymore. And so I would say one potential downside for Washington is just kind of a broader and more in-depth appreciation of how quickly the environment in China has changed, how quickly China is innovating. And then on the Chinese side, Jacob alluded to this in his opening comments, but I think it was Jorg Wukta, the former longtime president of the EU Chamber of Commerce, talked about this idea of how this kind of China fitness club around talent and around STEM education. I think the statistic was at over 3 million STEM graduates, Jacob, you shared, that graduate each year, and an equal number of graduates, that are graduating with all kinds of other degrees in programs and disciplines. When you have that many graduates, you can throw a lot of talent at a problem, right? You don't have to be super sophisticated, but you can just take a lot of swings at a given problem, or a question or an issue, and you're going to get there. Maybe not all of those STEM graduates have degrees equal to a PhD from MIT, but when you have the scale and the mass, right, you're able to move in a very fast direction. So there may be some inefficiencies still on the Chinese talent development side that are being closed, but that's still one area where the United States still has such just top talent when it comes to the educational opportunities that exist. And again, I worry a little bit when we talk about some of the tensions in the bilateral relationship, where we've had a lot of, in fact, collaboration in this space, where you have a lot of Chinese students studying in U.S. universities, where there's now pressures that may make that more challenging in the future. And the opposite, or the flip side of that challenge on the U.S. side, to underscore my point about kind of lack of understanding of China, we have far fewer now American students coming to China than we did, 7, 8, 9 years ago. And this potential space where we become more bifurcated, our populations, our societies, is not going to help create more innovation and solve problems that we need to solve as we start to think about what the future looks like and how technology will impact us if we don't have our societies finding ways to interact and collaborate around science and technology for the betterment of society. And I think a lot of that comes down to one last challenge I'll mention, and that's the kind of policy box that's placed so regularly on any and everything that in the U.S.-China relationship around national security, right? There's such a fear of kind of dual use challenges around technology development and collaboration and R&D cooperation that we're really cutting ourselves short in terms of finding ways for us to collaborate in the sciences because of the fear and concerns around national security. So that maybe the fundamental challenge here is just a lack of trust between the two nations right now, and how that's impacting, our ability to collaborate. So in terms of the two systems, I think there's actually a lot of areas where we bump into the same challenges, and I think that lack of trust is one that will have long-lasting negative impacts on our ability to just take care of our own people, right, and leverage science and technology for the betterment of society.
Thank you very much. And I know, Travis, that you have another engagement, so I'm going to go to a last question to you before moving back to the room. And I'm going to combine two questions that we got through Zoom, one of them on the recent tariffs on Liberation Day, and one on TikTok. And the question is, how are these tariffs and the upcoming decision on TikTok going to impact, first, the global economy, which is a really big question, but I want to add a second part, which is, what are the lessons that Chinese companies, and multinational companies are taking from this? What do they learn by looking at what Trump's doing with tariffs, Liberation Day, and decision on TikTok?
Sure. Yeah, that's a lot packed in that question. Great question. I think the big lesson being learned is that uncertainty is the theme of the day, right? For multinational companies that have, basically they have a commitment to the bottom line. They have to be profitable in order to succeed and in order to kind of meet their ability to accomplish whatever mission is, whatever sector they're involved in. And right now, with the uncertainty that exists around, right, new tariffs, potential ratcheting up of tensions in the bilateral relationship, multinational companies are seeing very short time horizons around which they feel comfortable investing. Where do you invest today? If you're a global company looking to manufacture, here's China with this incredible manufacturing infrastructure that has been so successful for the last several decades. But given the challenges around, is this the place, or do you go to Vietnam, or do you go to India, right? Do you put manufacturing back into the United States, as President Trump has asked, right? There's these big questions. And when the decision around capital investment is so critical to your ability to be profitable over a 5 or 10, or in some cases, some businesses are thinking, 10 to 20-year time horizons where they put their investment. It's very difficult today to make decisions. So the lesson learned is stay out of politics, keep your head down, and figure out how to navigate the uncertainty that exists, which is very challenging. When you think about what multinational companies are most concerned about, I'll kind of tick off five points. Number one, it's definitely geopolitics is top of the list for most firms. Tensions in the bilateral relationship, and then broader geopolitics. I think number two is the Chinese economy, kind of the slowing performance of the economy over the last couple of years, in particular for companies that operate in China. They're concerned about, will the economy pick back up? And I think there's been some positive signals over the last couple of months from the Chinese government that there are solutions forthcoming to ensure, an increase in consumption demand in China, and some signaling that is resonating well with leaders of multinational companies. Number three, we've talked about talent, right? The challenge of just recruiting talent. I'd say number four would be the regulatory environment still does present a number of challenges for companies operating in China. And so, combined with the top of that list is the geopolitics. And so the lesson learned is you need to find a way to basically be comfortable with uncertainty, because it's not going to change, right? There's no, we're going to turn this next corner and then we're going to see this nice long time horizon whereby we can then figure out how to, manage our business. Right now, the lesson being learned is very challenging environment. We have to figure out how to be comfortable with the uncertainty, with the noise, and be really, really wise, and in order to kind of stay out of the political crosshairs. And as we talked about earlier, kind of keeping on that tightrope and being compliant in the various locations where you're operating. On the TikTok, I think it's a real. I mean, I know that was one of the question, part of that question. I think it's really interesting to see what we saw, over the last couple of days. Again, an extension of the timeline. I think that means, though, President Trump is definitely open still to finding a solution here that's positive. Does that open a door potentially for Beijing and Washington to strike a deal? I think a month or so ago, I would probably say I felt more comfortable that there was a likelihood or a higher likelihood of finding space to strike a deal. I think at this point, we're probably not looking at a grand bargain kind of deal. We're probably looking at best case scenario, some kind of mini deal that would provide some minor tariff relief to China is more likely than some kind of grand bargain, which I think is probably less probable this year. Think, for example, is there some kind of space around, TikTok or fentanyl or Ukraine where there could be, an agreement around one or two specific issues rather than, a slate of issues that a grand bargain would incorporate. I think there's going to have to be some, for lack of a better term, some confidence building measures between Beijing and Washington around, tariffs, around some of these other more transactional issues before any kind of grand bargain discussion will be even put on the table.
Great. Thank you very much. And before you have to go, I do want to take a picture with both of our panelists and our director of the center. So if Chung, could you come up? Be part of us. And then we have one more question for Jacob if he's got the time.
Well, I want to say a few things. It's a fascinating discussion. And I know Travis for, I don't know, about 20 years. And we work together, or I work under your leadership about identifying Chinese rising stars. This is almost 20 years ago. We look at those in their 80s, born in 80s. But now look at the people we identify. They are the leaders in various works, in all walks of life in China, in academia, in IT, in media, in NGO, in university administration. Congratulations that, what you have achieved. At that time, it was the Bureau of Asian Studies, right? And also with the National Committee. We work very closely with Ambassador Stephen Roy and also Steve Biegun, who later became Deputy Secretary of Trump administration, right? And so as I listen to your remarks, that I feel more confidence that you will play a very, very important role in the future. You talk about the trust. Certainly, there's a deficit of trust in today's world, but not for you. And also the fact that you live in China, own friendship and the trust is very, very clear. So congratulations. I also want to comment on my young friend and Jacob. You talk about Guizhou, Heilongjiang, you spend a lot of time. And also you live in Shanghai and frequently visit Hangzhou. These are the two places. One is called China, one is kind of inland China, but both are driving China for the next stage of development. You present so well. I also really struck by your comment on Zheng Yongnian, who was my classmate at Princeton. I think he's probably the single most influential political scientist in China. Not only he influenced Chinese leadership, but also reached out to the large audience. But when I work in Washington, very, very few people talk about him. They never heard of him. So it's a terrible situation. So your expertise will be greatly in need, and particularly the fact that you now live in China. Now, because of the situation in China studies, I'm very, very disappointed. Partly because of COVID, partly because of decoupling and McCarthyism, political correctness, and the Chinese also has a lot of restraints. So, but the fact that you live in China, going out to see various parts of China, and also familiar very closely, follow up the academic discourse and Chinese scholarship and etc. I'm looking at different views like Wang Yangsen, like Zhang Jun, like Zheng Yongnian. This is really remarkable. So it gave me much confidence about the future. So with that, I wanted to give a small token of a gift. I will send to you when I see you, Travis, next time in Beijing or in China. I know that you will come to Hong Kong, but this is a small token for your new baby, right? You have two babies.
Wonderful. I think we're supposed to take a photo though.
Okay, yes. Okay.
Yeah. Dream bigger.
Likewise. Thanks, Jacob. Mali, wonderful job. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. And do you have time for one more
Of
question?
course, of course.
We'll just take one more question for Jacob here in the room. And this one is on higher education and US-China higher education in particular. As many of you may know, during the first Trump administration, there's a number of people in the cabinet as well as Congress who had pushed President Trump to stop US-China exchange programs. So basically ban Chinese students from studying in the US. And Trump himself said no. He's the one that vetoed this. But we're seeing a lot more aggressive policies from the Trump administration this time around. So I want to ask, what do you see the future of US-China higher education being, and how is that going to impact the tech competition in the years to come?
Thanks. Well, I can't predict exactly what Trump will do, but it seems to me that in most American major cities, Boston, San Francisco, New York, even in secondary school, like high school, Chinese Americans excel. And if you go to like, Thomas Jefferson in Northern Virginia, for example, it's mostly Chinese and Indian second generation students. So there's a lot of resentment about this. It's kind of funny that the Trump people are so against DEI because basically what they want to do is affirmative action for white people. But as I commented, it's kind of a joke, but not really. I think that the innovations of the future, it's for sure that ethnically Chinese people will be profoundly involved. So the only question is, are they going to be living in California or in China? And if all the smart Chinese people live in China, then it's game over. China won. So I hope that the Trump administration finds it in themselves to continue to allow ethnically Chinese and Asian people to live and work in the United States. At the same time, we definitely do see, I actually feel that the push factor from Trump is greater than the pull factor from China. I feel that China hasn't made it desirable enough for people to want to move from, say, Berkeley, California, or Charlottesville, Virginia, to Beijing. I mean, honestly, Beijing is a pretty difficult place to live. I'm impressed with Travis. Like for me, I mean, apples to apples, I live in a house with a yard in California, moved to Beijing. It's super cold 4 months of the year. I'm not so sure, but maybe this will change. It feels to me that domestic political tensions in the US tend to push away not only Chinese, but also Indian and people from other countries to other places. Nature had a poll, 75% of US scientists said they're considering leaving. Well, if that's the case, we're just the Soviet Union. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. We've come to the end of our time today. Thank you all for joining us virtually and in person, and have a great day.